Have you ever witnessed a moment so brutally uncomfortable that the entire room forgets how to breathe? A $15,000 bottle of vintage wine, a hushed, ultra-exclusive dining room, and a billionaire's booming voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Get this illiterate peasant out of my sight." That's exactly what Richard Sterling screamed at a quiet waitress named Sophia. He thought she was just another uneducated nobody he could humiliate to assert his dominance and impress his foreign investors. He was dead wrong. What happened next wasn't just a comeback. It was a flawless, 5-language execution that systematically destroyed an empire right at the dinner table. Listen closely. The chandeliers at L'Étoile Céleste didn't just illuminate the dining room, they weighed it down with an oppressive aura of wealth. Located in the beating heart of Manhattan, the restaurant boasted a 6-month waiting list, 3 Michelin stars, and a clientele whose net worth could rival the GDP of small nations. It was a place where fortunes were doubled over appetizers and careers were ended before dessert. For 26-year-old Sophia Bennett, it was simply a battlefield where she fought for her family's survival, one agonizingly polite smile at a time. Sophia wasn't supposed to be wearing a starched white apron, fetching sparkling water for hedge fund managers. Just 3 years prior, she had been a rising star at Georgetown University's prestigious School of Foreign Service, graduating at the top of her class with a mastery of 5 languages. She possessed an auditory memory that professors called a once-in-a-generation gift. She was destined for Geneva, for the United Nations, for a life of international diplomacy. But life, as Sophia learned the hard way, did not care about potential. The twist in her life came sharply and without warning. Her father, a seemingly successful logistics broker, suffered a catastrophic stroke. The tragedy unveiled a nightmare. He had been the victim of a massive corporate fraud scheme, his life savings wiped out, leaving behind a mountain of debt, and Sophia's teenage sister, Lily, who required round-the-clock specialized care for a severe autoimmune disease. The bank took their home. The creditors took the rest. Sophia abandoned her diplomatic dreams, withdrew her applications, and plunged into the only industry that offered immediate, untraceable and substantial cash, high-end hospitality. At L'Étoile Céleste, the tips from a single night in the VIP section could cover Lily's weekly medications. So, Sophia folded away her brilliance, locked her degrees in a cheap apartment drawer, and became invisible. In the high-end service industry, invisibility is the ultimate virtue. You are a ghost that brings bread, a phantom that pours wine. You do not have opinions, you do not have a voice, and you certainly do not have an intellect. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from strictly professional to sheer panic. Thomas Reed, the usually composed floor manager, was sweating profusely as he burst through the double doors of the kitchen. "Listen up!" Thomas clapped his hands, his voice trembling slightly. "Sterling is here. He just walked through the private entrance. He's booked the Onyx room for the entire night." A collective groan, quickly stifled by fear, rippled through the staff. Richard Sterling was the CEO of Sterling Global, a ruthless private equity firm known for hostile takeovers and gutting legacy companies. He was also notoriously difficult, a man who once threw a plate of truffles against a wall because they were sliced too thickly. He tipped well, but he demanded blood in return. His usual server, David, is out with the flu. Thomas continued, frantically scanning the room. His eyes landed on Sophia, who was methodically polishing a crystal decanter. "Sophia, you're on the Onyx room." Sophia looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Thomas, I usually work the main floor." "I don't care," Thomas snapped, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You're the only one here who doesn't crack under pressure. Sterling is hosting a massive dinner tonight. Word on the street is he's trying to broker a massive European shipping merger. He's got investors from France, Italy, Germany, and Russia at the table. It is extremely high stakes. You go in, you serve from the left, clear from the right, and you do not make a sound. You are the wallpaper. Understood?" "Understood," Sophia said quietly, untying her standard apron and reaching for the black silk vest reserved for the VIP rooms. As she walked toward the heavy oak doors of the Onyx room, Sophia took a deep breath. She could handle demanding men. She had served politicians, actors, and royalty. Richard Sterling was just another inflated ego with a heavy wallet. She just needed to keep her head down, survive the next 4 hours, and collect the tip that would pay for Lily's upcoming specialist appointment. She pushed the door open, stepping into the lion's den. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating an arrogant impatience. He was in his late 50s, impeccably tailored, with cold, calculating eyes that seemed to dissect everyone they landed on. Surrounding him were 4 men who looked equally intimidating. François Dupont, a silver-haired French maritime magnate, Klaus Wagner, a stoic German logistics tycoon, Lorenzo Rossi, an Italian shipping heir, and Dmitry Sokolov, a Russian harbor operator whose face looked like it was carved from granite. Sitting nervously next to Sterling was a young, sweating man in a cheap suit, clutching a leather portfolio. This was Arthur, Sterling's newly hired translator. Sophia silently poured the initial round of water, her movements fluid and practiced. But as she circled the table, her trained ears caught the terrifying reality of the room. Arthur was drowning, and Richard Sterling's multi-billion-dollar empire was about to sink with him. The dinner started disastrously and only accelerated downhill. Sophia stood silently in the corner, her back straight, hands clasped in front of her, projecting the image of oblivious subservience. But inside, her mind was firing on all cylinders. Every syllable spoken at the table registered in her brain, translating instantly. Sterling was aggressive, leaning forward and dominating the conversation in rapid-fire, idiom-heavy English. He was trying to pitch a unified logistics network, but he was completely failing to read the room. Worse, Arthur, the translator, was visibly out of his depth. He was a textbook academic translator, perhaps competent at translating documents in a quiet room, but entirely unprepared for the nuanced, high-stakes, multilingual crossfire of a corporate negotiation. "Tell DuPont that if he aligns his Atlantic fleet with us, we'll completely monopolize the freight lanes within 3 quarters. Sterling barked at Arthur, not even looking at the French magnate. "We'll crush the regional competition." Arthur swallowed hard, turned to François Dupont, and stammered in hesitant French. Sophia winced inwardly. Arthur didn't translate "monopolize the freight lanes." He had used a phrasing that roughly translated to, "We will violently conquer your local businesses." Dupont's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. In French corporate culture, subtlety and mutual respect were paramount. The translation made Sterling sound like an invading barbarian, not a strategic partner. Dupont replied in rapid, icy French. "I am not interested in violent conquests, Monsieur Sterling. I am interested in sustainable partnerships. Perhaps you misunderstand our market." Sterling looked at Arthur impatiently. "Well, what did he say? Is he in?" Arthur wiped his brow with a napkin. He says, he is not interested right now, sir. He thinks you don't understand him." Sterling's face flushed a deep, angry red. "What? Tell him he's being short-sighted." The dynamic was crumbling rapidly. Klaus Wagner, the German tycoon, began speaking to Lorenzo Rossi in broken English, expressing his doubts about Sterling's leadership. Dmitry Sokolov simply sat back, drinking his vodka, watching the American billionaire self-destruct with a look of amused contempt. Sophia stepped forward to clear the appetizer plates. She moved like a shadow, taking plates smoothly, careful not to interrupt. Sterling, feeling the deal slipping through his fingers, decided to employ a tactic of aggressive hospitality. He snapped his fingers at Sophia. It was a sharp, degrading sound. "You, girl," Sterling barked. Sophia turned, keeping her gaze politely lowered. "Yes, sir. Bring the Romane Conti, the 1990, and make it quick. We need something to loosen these gentlemen up," he ordered, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "Right away, sir," Sophia murmured. When she returned with the legendary bottle of wine, a bottle worth more than her car, the tension in the room was palpable. Sterling was actively arguing with Arthur, blaming the young translator for the misunderstandings. "Just tell Rossi that the tax liabilities are negligible," Sterling hissed. Arthur turned to the Italian heir. "Il signor Sterling dice che le tasse non sono importanti," Arthur said. "Mr. Sterling says taxes are not important." Lorenzo Rossi looked appalled. In Italy, waving away tax liabilities in a major shipping merger was a red flag for massive legal trouble. Sophia approached the table, presenting the cork and beginning the delicate process of decanting the ancient wine. She poured a small tasting measure for Sterling. He swirled it violently, barely smelling it before taking a gulp. "Fine. Pour it," he commanded. As Sophia moved to François Dupont's right side to pour, Sterling tried to salvage his connection with the Frenchman. "Tell François this wine is from my private estate collection," Sterling ordered Arthur. "Tell him I bought it directly from the vineyard cellar master, a testament to my commitment to long-term investments." Arthur, completely flustered and losing his grip on his vocabulary, turned to Dupont. He opened his mouth, but what came out was a mangled, garbled mess of French verbs. He accidentally used the word for stealing instead of buying, and completely botched the term for cellar master, making it sound like Sterling had acquired the wine through some shady back alley dealing. Dupont looked genuinely offended. He placed his hand over his glass, refusing the pour. He looked directly at Sterling, speaking in rapid, furious French. "If this is how you conduct your business, boasting of illicit acquisitions while insulting my market intelligence, I have no place at this table." Sterling, completely blind to what had actually been said, smiled tightly, thinking Dupont was complimenting the wine. He looked at Arthur. "Translate." Arthur was pale. He said he doesn't want the wine, sir." "What?" Sterling slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware rattle. "Why the hell not?" Sophia, still standing beside Dupont with the $15,000 bottle poised in her hand, hesitated for a fraction of a second. The injustice of it all, the sheer incompetence ruining a deal, grated against her trained linguistic instincts. Before she could stop herself, a barely audible whisper escaped her lips. "Il a été mal traduit," she breathed, almost silently to herself. It was mistranslated. It was a mistake, a tiny, human slip in her armor of invisibility. The room was so silent following Sterling's outburst that her quiet murmur carried straight to the billionaire's ears. Sterling's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing with a sudden, vicious fury. He needed a scapegoat for his failing dinner, and the lowly waitress who dared to make a sound was the perfect target. "What did you just say?" Sterling's voice was dangerously low. Sophia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "My apologies, sir." "Nothing." She attempted to step back, to melt into the shadows again. "No. You were muttering." Sterling stood up, his imposing figure towering over the table. He pointed a thick, manicured finger at her face. "You come in here. interrupting my business, muttering under your breath while holding a bottle you couldn't afford if you worked for 100 years. You are distracted. You are clumsy. Sir, I assure you— Shut up, Sterling roared. The 4 foreign investors watched in stunned silence. Arthur looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. You know why this country is failing? Because of incompetent, uneducated people like you. You can't even pour wine without making a scene. You don't understand a single thing happening at this table because you are an illiterate, uneducated peasant who is only good for carrying plates. The word hung in the air. Illiterate. Peasant. Thomas, the manager, had heard the shouting and cracked the door open, his face going pale as he saw the scene unfolding. He frantically signaled for Sophia to leave, to apologize and run. Sterling sneered, looking around at his guests to show them he was a man who demanded perfection and tolerated no weakness. Get out of my sight. Send someone in here who actually has half a brain. Sophia stood perfectly still. The terrified, submissive waitress routine, the armor she wore for 3 years, suddenly cracked. She thought of her father, a good man destroyed by arrogant, greedy men just like Sterling. She thought of Lily, suffering at home while this man screamed at her over his own incompetence. She looked at the bottle in her hand. Then she looked up. When Sophia met Richard Sterling's eyes, the subservient shadow was gone. In its place was the top-tier Georgetown linguist, the woman who could dismantle a diplomat's argument in 5 different dialects. She gently placed the bottle of Romanée Conti on the table with a soft, decisive clink. "I believe," Sophia said, her voice ringing out, crystal clear, no longer quiet, no longer trembling. "There has been a profound misunderstanding." The silence in the onyx room was so absolute that the distant, muffled clatter of the main kitchen felt miles away. Richard Sterling, a man accustomed to the world trembling when he raised his voice, simply stared. For a brief, suspended second, his brain short-circuited. He had expected tears. He had expected a stammering apology and a frantic retreat. He did not expect the icy, unwavering gaze of a woman who looked at him not as a billionaire, but as an obstacle. "What did you just say to me?" Sterling's voice dropped an octave, dripping with menace. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched white collar. Sophia didn't flinch. She kept her hands gently resting on the edge of the mahogany table, her posture straight, radiating a sudden, terrifying competence. "I said, Mr. Sterling, that there has been a profound misunderstanding," Sophia repeated, her English crisp, articulate, and completely devoid of the deferential waitress inflection she had worn all evening. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The authority in her tone commanded the room. "And if you continue to rely on your current translator, your ambitious plan to consolidate the transatlantic sea freight lanes will collapse before the appetizers are cleared." Arthur, the young translator, let out a pathetic squeak, sliding lower into his leather chair. "You insolent little—" Sterling began, stepping forward as if to physically remove her from the room. Sophia ignored him completely. She turned her body, directing her attention to François Dupont, the French maritime magnate who was still radiating quiet fury over the perceived insult regarding the wine and the business proposition. When Sophia spoke, the words flowed from her lips in flawless, aristocratic Parisian French. It wasn't the clumsy, textbook French Arthur had been stumbling through. It was the nuanced, sophisticated dialect of the diplomatic elite, perfectly accented and entirely natural. "Monsieur Dupont," Sophia began smoothly, her voice a soothing balm over the abrasive tension of the room. "Je vous prie d'accepter mes plus sincères excuses pour cette confusion monumentale." Monsieur Sterling n'a jamais eu l'intention d'insinuer une acquisition hostile de vos opérations maritimes. Monsieur Dupont, I beg you to accept my most sincere apologies for this monumental confusion. Mr. Sterling never intended to imply a hostile takeover of your maritime operations. Dupont blinked, visibly startled. The furious tightness around his eyes relaxed, replaced by sheer astonishment. He looked at the waitress in the black silk vest, then at the bottle of Romanée Conti, then back at her. Il y a eu une erreur de traduction tragique concernant la logistique, Sophia continued, stepping into the realm of high-stakes international trade with the ease of a seasoned broker. Ce qu'il proposait n'était pas de voler vos parts de marché, mais de créer une synergie d'entreposage. Il souhaite intégrer son infrastructure de chaînes d'approvisionnement avec vos réseaux portuaires en eau profonde. L'objectif est de réduire les frais de surestarie et d'optimiser l'organisation du transport maritime, pas de vous conquérir. There was a tragic translation error regarding the logistics. What he was proposing was not to steal your market share, but to create a warehousing synergy. He wishes to integrate his supply chain infrastructure with your deep-water port networks. The goal is to reduce demurrage charges and optimize the organization of sea transport, not to conquer you. Dupont's jaw slackened slightly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, entirely captivated. The specific terminology, demurrage charges, warehousing synergy, deep-water port networks, was music to his ears. It proved a deep, structural understanding of freight operations that had been entirely missing from Sterling's aggressive posturing. Vraiment? Dupont asked, his tone shifting from hostile to intensely curious. C'est ce qu'il essayait de dire? Truly? That is what he was trying to say? Oui, monsieur, Sophia nodded gracefully. Et concernant ce vin magnifique, il n'a pas été acquis de manière illicite. Il a été acheté légitimement pour célébrer ce qui, espère-t-il, sera un partenariat maritime très lucratif. Yes, sir. And regarding this magnificent wine, it was not acquired illicitly. It was purchased legitimately to celebrate what he hopes will be a highly lucrative maritime partnership. Dupont let out a sudden, booming laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He picked up his wine glass and held it out to Sophia. Eh bien, mademoiselle, vous venez de sauver ce dîner. Servez-moi, je vous prie. Well, miss, you have just saved this dinner. Pour for me, please. Sophia stepped forward and expertly poured the vintage wine, the deep red liquid catching the light. Sterling watched this exchange with a mix of utter bewilderment and mounting rage. He didn't speak a word of French. All he saw was the lowly waitress he had just humiliated, bantering comfortably with his most critical investor, an investor who was suddenly smiling and accepting the wine he had just rejected. What is going on here? Sterling barked, looking wildly from Sophia to Dupont. What did you say to him? Arthur, translate, now. Arthur was hyperventilating. I don't know, sir. She spoke too fast. She used technical maritime terms I don't know the vocabulary for. Sterling turned his fury back on Sophia. You! I am paying for this room. I am paying your salary. You will tell me exactly what you just said, or I swear to God, I will have you blacklisted from every restaurant on the eastern seaboard. Sophia finished pouring Dupont's wine, placed the bottle carefully in a silver coaster, and finally turned back to the billionaire. Her expression remained infuriatingly calm. I was merely explaining, Mr. Sterling, that your strategy involves optimizing warehouse operations and stabilizing freight charges across his European terminals, Sophia said in clear English. Your translator told him you intended to violently seize his local businesses and that you procured this wine through illegal smuggling. Sterling's face drained of color. He looked at Arthur, who shrank back, confirming the catastrophic error with his terrified silence. For a moment, the billionaire was speechless. His chest heaved as he processed the fact that he had been seconds away from a multi-billion-dollar international insult, saved only by the woman he had just called an illiterate peasant. But rather than gratitude, Richard Sterling's fragile ego twisted the realization into a deep, venomous resentment. He could not stand being corrected, let alone rescued, by someone he viewed as beneath his custom leather shoes. "Get out," Sterling hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "I don't care what parlor tricks you know. You are a waitress. You do not speak at this table. You do not look at my guests. Get out of my sight and tell Thomas you are fired. 9. A heavy, gravelly voice interrupted. It was Klaus Wagner, the stoic German logistics tycoon who had been watching the spectacle with narrowing eyes. He raised a massive hand, gesturing for Sophia to stay. He looked at Sterling with a mixture of pity and severe disapproval. "Herr Sterling," Wagner said, his English heavily accented but forceful, "you are acting like a fool. You are sending away the only person in this room who is making any sense." Sterling bristled. "Klaus, with all due respect, this is an internal staffing issue. I will not have insubordination." Wagner ignored him and turned his pale blue eyes to Sophia. He decided to test the depth of the waters he had just witnessed. "Sie sprechen von Liegegeldern und Hinterlandanbindungen," Wagner said, in rapid, complex German, leaning back in his chair. "Aber Sterling versteht nicht, dass die Frachtraten in Hamburg aufgrund von Zollverzögerungen explodieren. Wenn wir fusionieren, wie gedenkt er, den Engpass bei der Frachtabfertigung zu lösen?" "You speak of demurrage charges and hinterland connections, but Sterling doesn't understand that freight rates in Hamburg are exploding due to customs delays. If we merge, how does he plan to solve the bottleneck in freight forwarding?" Sterling threw his hands up. "Great, now he's doing it. Arthur. German, go," Arthur whimpered. "Sir, my German is only conversational. I don't know shipping logistics." Sophia didn't even blink. She pivoted slightly to face Wagner, shifting seamlessly into High German. Her tone became more direct, mirroring the efficient, no-nonsense business culture of the man she was addressing. "Herr Wagner," Sophia replied, her voice steady and confident. "Die Überlastung in Hamburg ist genau der Grund, warum diese Fusion notwendig ist. Mr. Sterling beabsichtigt, ein automatisiertes Zollabwicklungssystem zu implementieren, das an seine bestehende Software für das Lagermanagement gekoppelt ist. Dies würde die Abfertigungszeiten um 40% reduzieren und die Frachtraten stabilisieren. Es geht nicht nur um Schiffe, es geht um die intelligente Organisation des Seeverkehrs. Mr. Wagner, the congestion in Hamburg is exactly why this merger is necessary. Mr. Sterling intends to implement an automated customs clearance system linked to his existing warehouse management software. This would reduce clearance times by 40% and stabilize freight rates. It is not just about ships, it is about the intelligent organization of sea transport. Wagner's thick eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He slapped his hand hard on the table, letting out an approving grunt. "Ausgezeichnet," he proclaimed. He looked at Sterling. "She knows more about your operational strategy than you do, Richard. This is the first time tonight I have heard a viable solution to the terminal bottlenecks." Lorenzo Rossi, the Italian heir, suddenly chimed in, tossing his napkin onto his plate. He had been quietly fuming since Arthur's earlier blunder regarding taxes. "Scusa," Rossi interjected, gesturing wildly with his hands. "Ma che mi dici delle tasse? Ha detto che le tasse non sono importanti. In Italia questo significa prigione. Non faccio affari con I criminali." "Excuse me." But what about the taxes? He said taxes aren't important. In Italy, that means prison. I don't do business with criminals. Sterling looked like a cornered animal. What is he saying? Arthur, if you don't translate right now, I will ruin you. He thinks you're a criminal, sir, Arthur choked out. Sophia sighed softly, a tiny sound of purely professional exasperation. She turned her attention to the distressed Italian. The transition into Italian softened her vowels, bringing a musical, persuasive cadence to her voice. Signor Rossi, vi prego di perdonare l'incompetenza del traduttore, Sophia said, her tone deeply respectful. Quando il signor Sterling ha detto che le tasse erano trascurabili, intendeva dire che i benefici fiscali derivanti dall'integrazione delle vostre rotte marittime nel Mediterraneo supererebbero di gran lunga le passività iniziali. Si riferiva agli incentivi per il libero scambio, non all'evasione fiscale. La vostra integrità aziendale è la ragione principale per cui vi ha invitato a questo tavolo. Mr. Rossi, please forgive the translator's incompetence. When Mr. Sterling said the taxes were negligible, he meant that the tax benefits of integrating your Mediterranean maritime routes would far outweigh the initial liabilities. He was referring to free trade incentives, not tax evasion. Your corporate integrity is the primary reason he invited you to this table. Rossi paused, his dramatic hand gestures freezing in mid-air. He processed the flawless Italian, the respectful tone, and the logical business explanation. A slow smile spread across his handsome face. Ah, capisco. Questo ha molto più senso, he murmured, picking up his wine glass. Ah, I understand. That makes much more sense. 3 countries, 3 near-catastrophic diplomatic and logistical disasters averted in the span of 4 minutes. Sophia stood at the center of the room, completely composed. She had effortlessly woven complex international trade theory, sea transport logistics, and cultural diplomacy into 3 different languages, repairing a multi-billion-dollar negotiation that the billionaire at the head of the table had nearly destroyed with his arrogance. Sterling was hyperventilating. His face was a patchwork of red and purple. He was no longer the apex predator of the Onyx room. He was a spectator at his own dinner party. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the room practically spun. But there was one man left. Dmitry Sokolov, the terrifying Russian harbor operator, had not spoken a word. He sat slouched in his chair, swirling a glass of clear vodka, watching Sophia with dark, unreadable eyes. He was a man who had built his empire in the cutthroat, freezing ports of Vladivostok. He did not care about apologies, and he was not easily impressed by smooth talking. Sokolov set his glass down. The sharp clack drew everyone's attention. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his folded hands. He looked directly into Sophia's eyes, entirely ignoring Sterling. When Sokolov spoke, his voice was like grinding stones, deep and menacing. Amerikanci думают, что деньги могут купить им мозги. Sokolov rumbled in Russian, his tone laced with heavy sarcasm. Americans think money can buy them brains. This fool doesn't even know how to manage his own dinner. Why is a smart girl like you serving a pig like this? Arthur, trembling violently, opened his mouth. He said. Sophia held up a single, slender hand, silencing the translator instantly. She looked at the Russian oligarch. She knew this was a test. Sokolov was baiting her. If she mistranslated to protect Sterling, she would lose Sokolov's respect forever. If she translated accurately, Sterling would likely try to destroy her life. Sophia squared her shoulders. The armor of the invisible waitress shattered completely, leaving only the fierce, unyielding intellect of a woman who had survived the collapse of her own family's world. She opened her mouth, and the Russian language, harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving, spilled forth. The Russian language in the mouth of Dmitry Sokolov was a weapon, blunt and heavy. He had thrown it at Sophia like a gauntlet, waiting to see if she would shatter or strike back. The insult to Richard Sterling was glaring, calling the billionaire a pig who couldn't manage a dinner, let alone a global logistics network. It was the ultimate test of loyalty, intellect, and sheer nerve. Sophia stood motionless under the ambient glow of the chandeliers. She had spent the last 3 years in a financial and emotional winter, fighting for survival in the freezing, unforgiving cold of poverty and medical debt. She understood men like Sokolov. They were predators who respected only one thing: unyielding strength. If she acted like prey, if she cowered to protect Sterling's fragile ego, Sokolov would dismiss her entirely, and the deal would die. Taking a slow, measured breath, Sophia shifted her posture. She let the deference of the service industry fall away entirely. When she spoke, her Russian was a flawless, bone-chilling Moscow dialect, sharp as cracked ice and entirely devoid of fear. "Gospodin Sokolo," Sophia began, her voice steady, cutting through the heavy silence of the onyx room. "Mr. Sokolov, I serve him because survival demands adaptation. And a smart person knows that sometimes you must stand in the shadows to study the entire chessboard." Sokolov's dark eyes widened slightly, the heavy sarcasm melting away into genuine intrigue. Sophia didn't stop there. She leaned in, stepping fully into her expertise, determined to prove that she wasn't just a parlor trick, but a master of the very industry they were arguing over. "I understand the logistics of survival in extreme cold. I have analyzed terminal operations from the icebreakers of Murmansk to the complex, high-volume break-bulk yards of Shanghai port. Freight does not stop for the ice, Mr. Sokolov, and neither do I. I am here temporarily, until I win my game." For 3 agonizing seconds, the room held its breath. Even the other investors who didn't speak Russian could feel the seismic shift in the atmosphere. The waitress was no longer a waitress. She was an equal, holding court with one of the most dangerous men in Eastern Europe. Suddenly, a sound erupted from Dmitry Sokolov that no one at the table had heard all evening. It started as a low rumble in his chest and exploded into a booming, genuine laugh. He slapped the heavy mahogany table with a massive palm. "Ka! Potriasayushche!" Sokolov roared, his face splitting into a predatory grin. He raised his vodka glass to her in a clear, undeniable toast. "Ha! Outstanding! To your survival, chess player." Richard Sterling was practically vibrating with a mixture of terror and blind rage. The dynamic of the room had slipped entirely out of his grasp. He was a billionaire used to pulling the strings, yet here he was, locked out of a conversation at his own table, watching the Russian oligarch toast the very woman he had just tried to humiliate. "What did he say?" Sterling's voice cracked, a high-pitched sound of desperation. "Arthur, I swear to God, translate what they are saying right now." Arthur was physically shaking, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. I can't, sir. I didn't catch it all. She speaks it better than I do." Sterling's face contorted. He slammed his fist down, rattling the $15,000 bottle of Romane Conti. He glared at Sophia, his eyes bloodshot. "You. Translate, now. What did you say to him? What did he say about me?" Sophia slowly turned to face the billionaire. The time for hiding was over. The billionaire wanted to play the role of the arrogant tyrant, but he was about to realize he was completely outmatched. Mr. Sokolov expressed his observation that wealth doesn't equate to intelligence, Sophia said, in perfectly modulated English, her voice ringing clear and loud. He noted that you are incapable of managing a simple dinner negotiation, and he asked why an educated woman like myself was pouring wine for— She paused, letting a microscopic, lethal smile touch her lips. "A pig," Arthur whimpered. Thomas, the manager, who was still hovering near the cracked door, gasped audibly. Sterling's complexion went from red to a dangerous, mottled purple. The veins in his forehead throbbed. He had built his entire identity on dominating others, crushing the weak and bleeding companies dry like a corporate vampire. To be called a pig in his own private dining room by a waitress relaying a message from his most crucial investor was an insult that shattered his reality. "I told him," Sophia continued, mercilessly driving the final nail into the coffin, "that I am only serving you because I am currently surviving a winter of my own. I assured him that my understanding of international maritime logistics, from the freezing ports of Russia to the deep-water shipping lanes of international trade, is far superior to your translators." And he agreed. "You are fired!" Sterling screamed, his voice echoing off the walls. Spit flew from his lips. He pointed at the door. "Get out! Thomas, get security in here immediately. Throw this lying, illiterate piece of trash out onto the street. She is done. She will never work in this city again." Sophia didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at Sterling with the calm, detached pity one might reserve for a cornered, rabid animal. Because before Thomas could even push the door open to comply, the true power in the room shifted. "Sit down, Richard." The command didn't come from Sophia. It came from Klaus Wagner. The German tycoon's voice was like the crack of a whip, hard and unforgiving. Sterling froze, his arm still pointing toward the door. He whipped his head around to look at Wagner. "Klaus, this is an internal matter. This employee is wildly insubordinate and—" "Asseyez-vous," François Dupont echoed, his voice laced with aristocratic disdain. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit. "You will not lay a finger on her." "You are making a fool of yourself, Sterling," Lorenzo Rossi added in English, shaking his head in disgust. "The only person ruining this dinner is you." Sterling looked around the table, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The four investors, the men holding the keys to the greatest logistics merger of the decade, were looking at him not as a visionary leader, but as an unstable liability. The pack had turned on the supposed alpha. They had smelled the blood in the water, and it was his. Dmitry Sokolov stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the table. He looked at Sterling with a terrifying, deadpan expression. "If she leaves," Sokolov rumbled in heavily accented English, "we leave, and your little shipping empire stays exactly as it is. Small, weak, bleeding money." Sterling's arm slowly dropped to his side. The reality of the situation crashed down on him with the weight of a freight train. He was hundreds of millions of dollars over-leveraged on this deal. He had promised his board of directors that the European merger was a certainty. If these four men walked out that door, Sterling Global's stock would plummet by dawn. He would face an absolute corporate slaughter. He was trapped. Sterling swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked at Sophia, the woman he had dismissed as an uneducated peasant. She was no longer a shadow. She was the absolute center of gravity in the room. "Gentlemen," Sterling stammered, his arrogance rapidly deflating into panic. "Be reasonable. She is a hospitality worker. She has no place in a multi-billion-dollar corporate negotiation. She has more place here than that idiot," Wagner said, gesturing dismissively toward Arthur, who was practically trying to merge with the upholstery. "She understands demurrage. She understands the bottleneck in Hamburg. She understands the integration of sea transport software with port operations. You brought us a translator who couldn't order a sandwich without causing a diplomatic crisis. We are businessmen, Richard, Dupont said smoothly, swirling his glass of Romane Conti. We require competence. If we are to trust you with our fleets, we must trust the communication. I will only proceed with these preliminary talks tonight if Mademoiselle— Dupont looked at Sophia, raising an eyebrow inquiringly. Bennett, Sophia provided calmly. Sophia Bennett. If Miss Bennett remains in this room, translating directly for all of us, and overseeing the drafting of the initial terms, Dupont finished. Sterling looked like he was going to be physically sick. The ultimate humiliation. To save his empire, he had to submit to the demands of the waitress he had just verbally abused. He had to beg her to stay. The room waited in agonizing silence. The seconds ticked by, thick with tension. Finally, Richard Sterling broke. The blustering, arrogant billionaire slumped back into his chair, looking 10 years older. He didn't look at the investors. He looked down at his empty plate. Fine, Sterling muttered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked up at Sophia, his eyes burning with a hateful, defeated resentment. Stay. Translate. Just sit down. No, Sophia said. The word dropped into the room like a live grenade. Sterling's head snapped up, shock registering on his face. What? They just demanded you stay. They demanded I stay, Sophia corrected, her voice smooth and lethally calm. I have not yet agreed to do so. She walked slowly toward the empty chair next to Arthur, the chair that had been placed there for a subordinate. She didn't sit in it. She placed her hands on the back of the leather seat, commanding the room's attention. She was no longer fighting just to survive. She was fighting to win. This was the moment she overturned the injustice that had kept her family drowning. Mr. Sterling, 5 minutes ago, you called me illiterate. You called me a peasant. You attempted to humiliate me, to mask your own severe incompetence in international business, Sophia stated, her voice unwavering. You assume that because I wear an apron, my time and intellect are yours to command. They are not. Sokolov smiled thinly, resting his chin on his hand. He was thoroughly enjoying the execution. If you want my services tonight, and if you want to salvage this merger, Sophia continued, I am no longer acting as a server. I am acting as a specialized, multilingual logistics consultant. My fee for crisis mediation and real-time, 5-language simultaneous translation of international trade terms is $5,000 an hour, payable immediately upon the conclusion of this dinner. Sterling gasped. 5,000? Are you out of your mind? Additionally, Sophia pushed on, ignoring his outburst, my sister requires specialized medical care that your predatory healthcare investments have made nearly impossible to afford. Should this merger proceed over the next 6 months, I will be the lead communication director for the integration team. You will match my previous salary offers from the UN, plus a signing bonus that clears my family's remaining medical debt. Those are my terms. Arthur looked at Sophia as if she were a mythological creature. She was demanding a fortune and an executive position from a man known for destroying lives on a whim. Sterling's jaw worked furiously. He looked to the investors for help, hoping they would see this as extortion and side with him. Instead, Klaus Wagner nodded approvingly. A very reasonable rate for specialized maritime logistics consulting on such short notice. I pay my crisis managers in Berlin twice that. Pay the woman, Richard, Lorenzo Rossi said, highly amused by the drama. Or we leave. Your choice. Sterling was cornered. There was no escape. The billionaire, the man who prided himself on breaking others, had been entirely broken by a 26-year-old woman in a black silk vest. He reached into his jacket pocket, his hands trembling violently, and pulled out a gold-plated fountain pen and his personal checkbook. He furiously scribbled out a check, the scratching of the nib loud in the quiet room. He ripped it from the ledger and practically threw it across the table toward her. $20,000, Sterling spat, his voice thick with venom. For 4 hours. Now sit down and do your damn job. Sophia picked up the check. She looked at the zeros. It was more than enough to cover Lily's next 3 months of treatments, the back rent, and the groceries. It was the end of the freezing winter. She folded the check precisely in half and slipped it into the pocket of her vest. She then untied the vest, slipped it off her shoulders, and draped it neatly over the back of the chair. Underneath, she wore a simple, crisp white button-down shirt. The uniform of the invisible waitress was gone. Sophia Bennett pulled out the chair, sat down alongside the billionaire's, and folded her hands on the mahogany table. "Very well, gentlemen," Sophia said, her eyes sweeping the room, commanding the respect of every man present. "Let us discuss the restructuring of the Atlantic freight lanes." The next 4 hours in the Onyx room were nothing short of a masterclass in corporate warfare, conducted entirely by a woman who had spent the last 3 years serving bread baskets. With Sophia Bennett at the helm, the chaotic, aggressive posturing that had defined Richard Sterling's strategy was completely neutralized. She didn't just translate, she mediated, interpreted, and negotiated. When Klaus Wagner raised concerns about the integration of container tracking systems with competitors like Maersk, Sophia seamlessly pivoted to High German, proposing a blockchain ledger system she had studied extensively during her time analyzing the maritime trade routes of Vietnam and Europe. When François Dupont hesitated over the valuation of his deep-water fleet, Sophia switched to Parisian French, softly reminding him of the tax subsidies hidden within the latest European Union maritime regulations, a detail Sterling's expensive legal team had entirely missed. Throughout it all, Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table, entirely muted. He was a ghost at his own feast. Every time he tried to interject, attempting to reclaim a shred of his dominance, Dmitry Sokolov would silence him with a single, terrifying glare. Sterling was reduced to watching his company's future being meticulously rewritten by the waitress he had tried to destroy. Arthur, the young and thoroughly traumatized translator, had been relegated to taking meeting minutes in the corner, his hands shaking as he typed. By 1 a.m., the terms of the merger were finalized. It was a brilliant, ironclad agreement that stabilized freight charges, optimized terminal operations, and created a massive, unified logistics network. But there was a catch, a massive twist that Sterling didn't see coming until it was written in black and white. The structural integrity of this deal relies entirely on clear communication and mutual respect, Lorenzo Rossi stated in English, tapping the drafted contract with his pen. Therefore, Sterling, you will not be the primary director of the European integration branch. You lack the diplomacy required. Sterling choked on his scotch. What? It's my company. I am the CEO. You are the financier, Klaus Wagner corrected coldly. Nothing more. If we are to merge our legacy fleets with your infrastructure, we require a liaison we can actually trust. Someone who understands the complexities of our individual markets. Wagner turned his gaze to Sophia. Miss Bennett, we are establishing the Central Integration Office in Geneva. We would like you to run it. Your starting salary will be $400,000 a year, with full executive benefits. Sophia looked at the German tycoon, her heart hammering against her ribs. Geneva, the United Nations hub. The very city she had been destined for before her father's catastrophic stroke had plunged her into an endless, freezing winter of debt. I accept, Herr Wagner, Sophia said, her voice steady, though a profound wave of relief washed over her soul. Thank you. Sterling slammed his hands on the table, standing up so violently his chair tipped backward. This is extortion. I will not allow this. I will cancel that $20,000 check the second the banks open, and I will tie you all up in litigation for a decade. Dmitry Sokolov rose slowly, towering over the furious billionaire. The Russian oligarch reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. You will not cancel the check, Richard, Sokolov rumbled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. Because while Miss Bennett was brilliantly drafting our operational logistics, my financial team in Moscow was looking into Sterling Global's private ledgers. We know you are over-leveraged. We know about the hidden debt you tried to conceal from us tonight. If you try to back out of this deal, or if you dare to touch a single cent of that young woman's money, I will personally leak your financial insolvency to the Wall Street Journal by 6 a.m. Your stock will be completely worthless before you even finish your morning coffee. Sterling went dead pale. The color drained from his face until he looked like a wax figure. He looked at the four tycoons, their faces completely unified in their disdain for him. Then he looked at Sophia. The arrogant, untouchable king of corporate takeovers had been checkmated. You set me up, Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. No, Mr. Sterling, Sophia said quietly, standing up and smoothing down her crisp white shirt. You set yourself up. You assumed that cruelty was a substitute for intelligence and that money gave you the right to treat people like dirt beneath your shoes. I merely translated your true character for the room. The dinner concluded not with handshakes for the billionaire, but with respectful nods directed entirely at Sophia. The investors departed into the rainy Manhattan night, leaving Richard Sterling alone in the Onyx room, staring at a signed contract that stripped him of his power. The next morning, the winter finally broke for the Bennett family. Sophia walked into the billing department of Johns Hopkins Hospital, bypassing the agonizing payment plans she had relied on for years. She handed over a cashier's check that covered her sister Lily's specialized autoimmune treatments for the next 5 years. The crippling, suffocating weight of medical debt evaporated in an instant. A week later, a press release rocked the financial world. Sterling Global announced a historic maritime merger, accompanied by the sudden, immediate, early retirement of its controversial CEO, Richard Sterling. The board of directors, informed by the European investors of Sterling's near-catastrophic behavior and hidden debts, had forced him out to save the deal. As for Sophia, she never wore a waitress apron again. She packed her bags, hugged her recovering sister, and boarded a first-class flight to Geneva. She had walked into l'Étoile Céleste as an invisible, underestimated ghost. She walked out as the director of European integration, a woman who had turned the ultimate insult into the ultimate victory, proving forever that true power doesn't come from a bank account. It comes from the mind. Sophia's incredible journey reminds us that true brilliance cannot be hidden forever, no matter how hard life tries to bury it. Richard Sterling made the fatal mistake of judging a book by its cover, assuming that a white apron meant a lack of intelligence. He learned the hard way that respect is the ultimate currency, and arrogance will always be the architect of its own downfall. Sophia didn't just survive her darkest chapter. She used her intellect, her patience, and her unparalleled skills to rewrite her entire destiny, proving that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you least expect. If this story of ultimate revenge and hard-earned justice gave you chills, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never underestimate themselves, And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on another incredible true-life drama. What would you have done in Sophia's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.